In a frozen German forest, one hidden MG-42 stopped an entire platoon without ever being seen. Private Daniel Kowalski realized the gun wasn't aiming at men, it was aiming at sound. So he stood up, made himself the loudest thing in the woods, and let the machine gun chase him instead of the platoon. February 1945. The ridge outside the German village of Schmidt was quiet in a way that felt wrong. Snow covered everything, muting footsteps, swallowing sound, and turning the pine forest into a maze of white trunks and shadow. Visibility was barely 30 yards. Beyond that, shapes dissolved into gray. U.S. infantry platoon had been ordered to hold the ridge until nightfall. Behind them, an artillery battery was setting up in a shallow clearing, guns still uncamouflaged, crews exposed. If the Germans broke through the trees, the battery would be destroyed before it could fire a single round. The problem appeared almost immediately. Two opened up from downhill. The first burst cut through the forest at an angle that made no sense. The sound cracked and echoed, bouncing off trees, impossible to place. Men dropped instinctively, pressing into frozen ground that could not be dug. The second burst came from what sounded like a different direction. Then a third. The gun was walking, its fire, not searching blindly, but reacting. The attempt to shift positions triggered another burst. Muzzle flash. There was none. Snow absorbed the light, trees swallowed it. The gun was firing uphill, perfectly positioned, its crew invisible and protected by the terrain. The forest magnified confusion and punished movement. It's passed. No one was hit yet, but everyone understood the math. Staying still meant eventual death. Moving without a plan meant immediate death. Radios crackled softly, useless. Artillery support was impossible with friendly troops so close and no clear target. First Class Daniel Kowalski lay behind a fallen tree, listening. He wasn't watching the forest the way the others were. He wasn't looking for flashes or shapes. He was listening to how the gun reacted. Each burst came seconds after a sound snow crunching, a branch snapping, a whispered order carried too far in the cold air. The machine gun wasn't tracking men. Kowalski understood something then that no map or briefing had explained. As long as the Germans controlled the soundscape, the platoon would never move. The forest itself had become part of the weapon. That meant the forest could be used against them if someone was willing to draw the fire. Kowalski shifted slightly and snapped a branch on purpose. The response was instant. The MG-42 roared, bullets chewing bark where the sound had come from. The burst was long, urgent, as if the gunner was determined to erase the noise itself. When the firing stopped, the forest fell silent again, tense and waiting. Kowalski tried it a second time. He kicked loose ice with his boot and let it slide down the slope. Another burst followed, this one walking higher, searching for a body that wasn't there. The pattern was clear now. The machine gun wasn't covering ground randomly. It was reacting, aggressively and predictably, to any disturbance. He crawled back toward the platoon leader and spoke just above a whisper. He didn't use tactics or doctrine. He kept it simple. The gun is firing at sound. If it chases noise, it can't watch everything at once. The platoon leader didn't answer immediately. He listened to another burst, this one triggered by a soldier shifting his pack too loudly. The realization settled in. The forest wasn't neutral. It was an amplifier. Whoever controlled noise controlled movement. Had no smoke, no armor, no time. The artillery battery behind them was still exposed. Kowalski didn't wait for permission. He already knew what he was going to do. He stood up behind a line of trees and shouted, loud and sudden, then fired a single shot into the air. He ran laterally along the ridge, crashing through brush, snapping branches, making himself impossible to ignore. G-42 locked onto him immediately. The machine gun opened up with full force, the sound tearing through the trees as bursts followed Kowalski's movement, Tracers slashed between trunks, cutting into snow where he had been seconds earlier. The gunner was no longer suppressing a ridge. He was hunting a single target. It was the opening. Moved at once, downhill and opposite Kowalski's path, stepping carefully, deliberately, making no sound. Without the gun's attention on them, the forest changed. What had been a cage became cover. Trees that had offered no protection now blocked sidelines and masked movement. Kowalski felt the first hit like a hammer to the leg. He fell, rolled, and kept shouting, kept firing, kept breaking branches. The gun stayed with him, convinced it was winning. Another burst shredded the snow inches from his head. He crawled behind a thick pine, breathing hard, forcing himself to stay loud. And stretched. Each one bought the platoon distance. Then the firing shifted abruptly, not toward Kowalski, but downward. The platoon had closed in. The MG-42's angle was wrong. The gun tried to traverse, but it was too late. Grenades went in first. The forest flashed white and orange. When the echoes faded, the machine gun was silent. Kowalski lay still in the snow, bleeding, listening to footsteps that were finally moving forward instead of stopping. The forest did not go quiet all at once. There were still echoes, shouted commands, the metallic clatter of equipment being kicked aside. But the MG-42 was gone, and with it the pressure that had pinned the platoon in place since dawn. Soldiers reached Kowalski first. He was conscious, teeth clenched against the pain, snow already dark around his leg. The bone was shattered below the knee. Blood soaked through his trousers and froze almost instantly. He tried to sit up anyway, asking if the gun was down before anyone could answer. Beside him, one hand pressed against the wound, the other gripping Kowalski's shoulder. There was no speech, no praise, just a nod. The kind given between men who understood that something irreversible had just happened. Behind them, the platoon fanned out, securing the ridge. The artillery battery began moving forward, crews working fast, no longer glancing nervously into the trees. What had been a fragile hold minutes earlier was now solid ground. Medic finally cut through the crowd, morphine already in hand. Kowalski protested weakly, pointing downhill, worried there might be another gun. There wasn't. The Germans had fallen back once their anchor was gone. The forest, which had betrayed them earlier, now worked against the retreating defenders. Kowalski was lifted onto a stretcher. The sounds of preparation filled the ridge, metal scraping, low voices, the steady rhythm of guns being emplaced. The platoon had done what it was sent to do. Kowalski was carried rearward, the trees closing behind him. He never saw the artillery fire that night. He never saw the shells arc over the ridge and hammer German positions beyond the forest, but he had made that fire possible. Everyone on that ridge knew it. By nightfall, the ridge outside Schmidt no longer belonged to the forest or the machine gun that had ruled it all morning. American artillery thundered from positions that had been death traps hours earlier, shells tearing through German lines that never expected the guns to survive the day. Kowalski was already miles to the rear by then, drifting in and out of consciousness as medics fought the cold and the blood loss. He would lose the leg below the knee. He would never return to the front. His war ended not with a victory parade or a citation, but on a stretcher bouncing along a frozen road. After-action report reduced the fight to a sentence. Enemy machine gun neutralized. Platoon held ridge. No mention of sound. No mention of a man running sideways through snow to draw fire away from everyone else. That was how most such moments disappeared, compressed into language that could be typed and filed. The men who were there, the lesson stayed sharp. They learned that control on the battlefield was not always about firepower or visibility. Sometimes it was about perception. The MG-42 had been powerful, but it had depended on one assumption that fear would freeze movement. When that assumption failed, the gun became blind. Kowalski never described what he did as bravery. Years later, when asked, he said only that someone had to make the noise so everyone else could move. He never framed it as sacrifice. To him, it was a practical decision made in a bad situation. The ridge outside Schmidt would not appear in history books. No map would mark where the gun had stood or where Kowalski fell, but every man in that platoon carried the memory forward, a quiet understanding that sometimes the only way to break a trap is for one person to step into it on purpose. That is how the platoon held the ridge, not by overpowering the enemy, but by giving the machine gun exactly what it wanted until it wanted the wrong thing. The lesson did not end with the ridge. Later, replacements filtered into the unit, young men who had not heard the gun in the forest, who had not felt how silence itself could become a weapon. The veterans did not tell the story loudly. They did not turn it into a boast or a warning. They taught it quietly, in small corrections. Move when the gun is distracted. Listen before you look. Control what the enemy reacts to, not just what he can see. Kowalski had revealed was not a trick, but a truth about combat that rarely appears in manuals. Weapons do not dominate ground on their own. They dominate ****, attention, ****. The MG-42 had controlled the ridge because it controlled what everyone reacted to. Once that control was hijacked, the entire situation unraveled. Understanding followed the platoon into later fights. In villages, they watched how Germans fired at windows instead of alleys. In open fields, they noticed how bursts chased movement rather than purpose. They learned that fear could be steered, that enemy fire could be pulled like a lever if someone was willing to expose themselves first. Everyone survived long enough to apply the lesson. War did not become fair just because it became clearer, but the men who lived understood something fundamental. Most battlefield traps persist not because they are unbreakable, but because breaking them requires someone to act against instinct. Kowalski never returned to that forest. He returned to a country that moved on quickly, a country that had no language for explaining how sound, snow, and fear could decide who lived and who died. He built a life on one leg. He worked. He married. He rarely spoke about the ridge. Men who stayed carried the story forward, without names or medals attached. They carried it as a rule of survival. When the enemy controlled the fight, someone had to change the terms, even if that meant becoming the focus of everything the enemy had. That's how the platoon remembered him, not as a hero, not as a symbol, but as the man who taught them that sometimes the only way to move forward is to give the enemy exactly what he thinks he wants until it costs him everything. What followed, long after the forest and the ridge had slipped behind the front lines, was the slow, uneven process of understanding what that moment had actually meant. Not understanding in an academic sense, but the kind that settles into behavior, into instincts, into the way men move and think when things begin to go wrong. It does not pause to allow lessons to be neatly learned. It continues, indifferent to insight. The platoon that left Schmidt carried the memory forward not as a story, but as a reflex. When fire erupted suddenly, they listened before they reacted. When pinned, they asked not only where the enemy was, but what the enemy was responding to. Noise, movement, expectation, those became as important as weapons and cover. Shift did not make combat safer, it made it more honest. The men understood that control on the battlefield was often psychological, long before it was physical. A machine gun did not dominate because it killed everyone it fired at. It dominated because it convinced people that movement was futile. Once that belief took hold, the gun no longer needed to be accurate. Fear did the work for it. Kowalski had broken that mechanism by refusing to behave the way the weapon expected. He did not seek cover. He did not freeze. He moved loudly and visibly, forcing the gun to reveal its priorities. In doing so, he exposed the gap between suppression and control. Suppression could be redirected. Control could be stolen. The idea unsettled many of the men who thought about it too deeply. It suggested that survival sometimes depended less on strength than on understanding how violence shaped behavior. It also suggested something more disturbing, that survival often required someone to accept disproportionate risk so others could function, not because they were ordered to, but because the situation demanded it. The war pushed deeper into Germany. These realizations collided with exhaustion. The men were tired beyond anything they had known before. They did not talk about ideals or victory. They talked about getting through the next hour. In that environment, Kowalski's action became less a memory of heroism and more a reminder of a hard rule. When everyone waits for safety, no one moves. The rule applied beyond combat. It applied to clearing roads under fire, to evacuating wounded under shelling, to holding collapsing lines long enough for others to withdraw. Over and over, someone had to step into uncertainty so the group could regain balance. Not everyone did. Not everyone could. But the ones who did shaped outcomes in ways that statistics never captured. Kowalski's absence was felt in subtle ways. There was no replacement for what he had done, not because of his personality, but because of the timing. He had acted at the precise moment when action mattered more than survival. Timing, more than courage, determined the value of his choice. 5 minutes earlier or later, the same act might have meant nothing. In war, meaning is brutally situational. Later, when veterans tried to explain experiences like this to people who had never been there, language failed them. Civilian life is built on the assumption that risk can be managed collectively and consequences distributed fairly. War violates that assumption at every level. It concentrates risk arbitrarily and resolves problems through irreversible outcomes. That's why stories like Kowalski's resist comfortable moral framing. They are not about virtue rewarded or sacrifice acknowledged. They are about moments when systems collapse to the point where individuals must act as systems themselves. For a few seconds or minutes, one person carries the function of many. Burden leaves marks. Even for those who survive physically, the memory of choosing to draw fire, to become the focus of destruction, lingers in ways that are difficult to articulate. It alters how danger is perceived. It erodes the belief that survival is purely a matter of luck or skill. It introduces the unsettling idea that survival is often purchased, not earned. Kowalski rarely spoke of the Ridge because there was no audience for the truth of it. People wanted clean narratives, bravery, sacrifice, victory. What he carried was messier. He remembered the sound of the gun chasing him, the certainty that it would not stop until he did, the knowledge that his pain was buying time, measured in seconds. Those are not memories that translate easily into conversation. Platoon, too, moved on. Units dissolved, men were killed, wounded, reassigned. The war ended, lives resumed in fragments, but the lesson did not vanish. It resurfaced in moments of crisis long after the shooting stopped, on factory floors, in emergency rooms, in disasters where someone had to move first while everyone else hesitated. It is the quiet afterlife of battlefield decisions. They do not remain confined to war. They bleed outward into how people understand responsibility and risk. They challenge the assumption that safety is something that can always be preserved while change occurs. Kowalski's story, stripped of names and dates, becomes uncomfortable precisely because it asks a question without offering reassurance. What happens when the only way forward requires someone to accept harm so others can act? Most societies prefer not to ask that question at all. War forces it into the open. That's why remembrance matters, but not in the way monuments suggest. Remembering is not about elevation, it is about containment. It is about ensuring that such moments remain exceptions rather than expectations. It is about recognizing the cost embedded in decisions that appear decisive from a distance. Kowalski's action teaches anything enduring. It is this: control is fragile, fear is manipulable, and progress often depends on someone breaking a pattern that everyone else believes is fixed. But it also teaches something equally important. No one should be placed in a position where that kind of choice becomes necessary. Just outside, Schmidt did not care who lived or died. The machine gun did not care either. The only thing that cared was a group of men trying to survive long enough to complete a task imposed on them. One of them understood how the trap worked and chose to step into it. Choice rippled outward, not as inspiration, but as knowledge. Knowledge carried quietly, applied cautiously, and remembered with a gravity that resisted simplification. It is not a lesson meant to be celebrated. It is a lesson meant to be respected and, if possible, avoided. The clearest truth to emerge from that frozen ridge is not that one man saved many. It is that the circumstances that required him to do so represent a failure far larger than any individual act can redeem. What lingers most after stories like this is not admiration, but unease. Unease because they expose how thin the line is between order and collapse, between collective safety and individual sacrifice. In the forest outside Schmidt, the system failed quietly. There was no dramatic breakdown, no shouted panic, just a machine gun doing its job too well, and a platoon rendered immobile by the logic of fear. The failure was subtle, almost invisible, which made it more dangerous. This is why such moments are rarely anticipated. Armies prepare for enemy movements, not for the psychological deadlocks that emerge when terrain, weapons, and expectation align too perfectly. No doctrine accounts for the moment when everyone understands the problem, but no one can move without becoming the solution. In those moments, the battlefield stops being a contest of strength and becomes a test of willingness. Kowalski's decision existed in that narrow space. He did not defeat the enemy by force. He defeated a pattern. Patterns are harder to see and harder to break because they feel natural once established. The machine gun fired when it heard sound. The platoon froze when it heard the machine gun. Each side reinforced the other. That loop could have continued until artillery or reinforcements intervened, or until the platoon was destroyed piecemeal. Breaking the loop required someone to act irrationally by conventional standards. It introduces another uncomfortable truth. Rational systems can be defeated by irrational behavior, but only at a cost. Kowalski's action made sense only because he was willing to absorb consequences that no rational system would assign voluntarily. He did not disrupt the loop safely. He disrupted it violently and personally. That is why the lesson cannot be abstracted cleanly. It resists replication because it depends on a willingness that cannot be standardized. Time, veterans often struggle with how to place such memories. They do not fit neatly into categories of success or failure. The platoon held the ridge. The artillery fired. The mission succeeded. And yet, the cost feels disproportionate when reduced to outcomes alone. One life altered permanently so that others could continue unchanged. War normalizes these exchanges, but memory resists that normalization. Also, the question of silence. Kowalski's name did not appear in commendations. His action was not elevated to myth. That silence is not accidental. Military institutions are cautious about highlighting actions that rely on extreme individual risk without orders. To do so risks encouraging imitation without context. The system needs such actions to occur, but it cannot openly endorse them. Tension creates a strange kind of invisibility. The most consequential acts at the lowest level often leave the faintest traces in official history. They survive instead in personal memory, passed from one soldier to another in fragments. A warning here, a reminder there. Never framed as a rule, always as a caution. Years pass. Those fragments become harder to access. The men who carry them age. The urgency fades. New conflicts arise with new technologies, and it becomes tempting to believe that such moments belong to a less sophisticated era. But the underlying dynamics remain. Fear still shapes movement, attention still defines control, and situations still arise where systems fail faster than they can adapt. That's why the true value of remembering stories like Kowalski's lies not in preserving detail, but in preserving awareness. Awareness that beneath every plan is an assumption about human behavior. Awareness that when those assumptions break, consequences cascade rapidly. Awareness that adaptability sometimes requires actions that no plan would recommend. Danger, of course, is misinterpretation. It is easy to read such stories as endorsements of self-sacrifice. They are not. They are records of what happens when options disappear. They describe the edge of human capacity, not a standard to be met, treating them as inspirational risks, erasing the suffering that made them necessary. In civilian life, we often celebrate those who step up in crises. The language sounds similar, but the reality is different. In most crises, stepping up does not require absorbing lethal risk. In war, it often does. Conflating the two cheapens the cost and obscures the difference between courage chosen freely and courage demanded by circumstance. He did not return to the ridge, but the ridge returned to him in quieter ways, in sudden noises, in moments of hesitation, in an enduring awareness of how quickly control can vanish. For the men who moved past him into the trees, the memory likely surfaced whenever they heard a machine gun open up and felt that familiar tightening in the chest. Somewhere in that moment was the knowledge that fear could be redirected, but never eliminated. In societies, we prefer narratives that resolve: beginning, middle, end, problem, action, solution. War refuses this structure. It produces solutions that create new problems, actions that close one path while opening another. Kowalski's choice solved an immediate tactical dilemma. It did not solve the war or even the day. It simply allowed time to move forward. It may be the most honest way to understand it, not as salvation, but as continuation. War advances not because it becomes just, but because people make decisions that keep it moving. Some of those decisions are strategic, some are administrative, and some are deeply personal, made in seconds, with consequences that last a lifetime. Remembering those moments responsibly means resisting the urge to make them comforting. They are not meant to comfort. They are meant to unsettle. To remind us that behind every movement of a line on a map lies a chain of human choices, some of them unbearably costly. The forest outside Schmidt is likely quiet now. Trees grow where bullets once cut bark. Snow falls without gunfire. Nothing in the landscape marks what happened there. That absence is fitting. The ground does not remember. People do. If there is any obligation that comes with remembering, it is this: to ensure that stories like Kowalski's are treated not as proof of what people should be willing to do, but as evidence of what should never be required of them again. The weight of that understanding settles slowly. It does not arrive as a single realization, but as a series of small recognitions that surface over time. Long after the war, long after uniforms are folded away and weapons rust into museums, the logic of moments like Schmidt continues to shape how people interpret risk and responsibility. The quiet consequences is a changed relationship with certainty. Those who have seen how quickly control can collapse rarely trust stability completely again. They know that systems function only as long as their assumptions hold, and that when those assumptions break, the burden shifts instantly to individuals. This awareness does not make life darker, but it does make it sharper. It strips away the comfort of believing that someone else will always intervene. Kowalski, that awareness likely manifested in ordinary decisions, in noticing when silence becomes dangerous, in recognizing when hesitation compounds risk, in understanding that waiting for perfect conditions is often a luxury that does not exist. These are not dramatic insights. They are practical, carried quietly, applied without fanfare. Who moved forward that day carried something similar. They had learned, viscerally, that fear is not an absolute force. It can be shaped, redirected, even exploited, but only briefly, and only at a cost. That knowledge did not make them reckless. If anything, it made them more cautious, more attentive to how easily situations could spiral beyond control. This is the paradox at the heart of such stories. They are about decisive action, yet they often produce restraint rather than aggression, in those who live with them. Having seen what decisive action truly costs, these men understood its value and its limits. They did not seek to repeat it. They sought to avoid the conditions that demanded it. Generations pass. The challenge becomes how to transmit this kind of understanding without diluting it. Written accounts preserve facts, but facts alone are insufficient. The deeper lesson lies in context, in the tension between necessity and choice, in the awareness that some solutions are only solutions because everything else has failed. Why stories like Kowalski's resist closure. There is no lesson that neatly resolves into guidance or policy. There is only a cautionary truth, that when systems push individuals to absorb unbearable risk, the system itself has already failed in some essential way. Individual courage may patch the failure temporarily, but it does not erase it. Remembering this does not diminish the act. It honors it by refusing to turn it into a precedent. It acknowledges the humanity of the person who acted and the injustice of the situation that required such action. It keeps the focus where it belongs, not on celebrating the cost, but on questioning why the cost was necessary at all. End. The forest outside Schmidt offers no moral clarity, only honesty. It shows how quickly order can dissolve, how narrowly catastrophe can be avoided, and how unevenly the price of survival is often distributed. It reminds us that behind every apparent success lies a set of choices made under pressure, some of which leave scars long after the danger has passed. That's why these stories matter, even when they are uncomfortable. They resist the simplifications that make conflict palatable. They insist on complexity, on acknowledging that progress achieved through sacrifice carries an obligation to remember what was lost along the way. He did not seek meaning in what he did. Meaning was assigned later, by others trying to understand an event that defied easy explanation. Perhaps the most respectful response is not to extract inspiration or instruction, but to sit with the discomfort the story creates. In that discomfort lies the clearest warning of all. When the only way forward requires someone to step into harm on behalf of others, the real failure is not theirs. It belongs to the circumstances that made such a choice necessary. That warning is easy to acknowledge in theory and difficult to honor in practice. Societies remember sacrifice more readily than they prevent the conditions that require it. Over time, memory softens edges. Context thins. What remains is a shape. Someone stood up, someone ran forward, others lived. The reasons why that moment existed in the first place fade into the background. Reasons matter more than the act itself. The problem was not a lack of courage, training, or equipment. It was a convergence of terrain, weapon design, and human expectation that produced paralysis. Those convergences still happen. Different places, different technologies, same result. The lesson is not that individuals should be prepared to sacrifice themselves, but that systems must be designed with the humility to expect failure and the flexibility to recover without demanding it. It's uncomfortable because it resists clean solutions. It asks planners, leaders, and societies to accept that no amount of preparation can remove uncertainty, and that when uncertainty becomes absolute, someone will bear it personally. The goal, then, is not to eliminate risk that is impossible, but to distribute it as fairly as possible and to recognize when distribution has failed. Kowalski's choice existed at the far end of that failure. It was the last lever available when all others were locked. That is why it should never be used as a benchmark for character. Benchmarks imply repetition. What happened there should remain rare, specific, and regrettable even as it is respected. Also a quieter implication that often goes unspoken. When individuals are forced to act as substitutes for broken systems, the systems may appear to succeed. The ridge is held, the guns fire, the line advances. From a distance, the outcome looks acceptable. That appearance can mask the underlying fragility that produced the moment in the first place. Success achieved through extraordinary personal cost can delay reform by making failure seem manageable. Remembering responsibly means resisting that temptation. It means asking not only who acted bravely, but why they had to. It means holding space for gratitude without allowing gratitude to become an excuse for complacency. Those who lived through such moments, the burden is different. They carry a dual awareness, that someone's actions saved them and that the saving came at a price that should never have been required. Gratitude and grief coexist. Respect does not erase loss. Understanding does not dull pain. Time changes how these things are held, but it does not remove them. Stories pass from witness to listener. There is a choice in how they are framed. They can be told as proof that people rise to the occasion, or as evidence that occasions can become intolerable. The first framing comforts, the second cautions. Both are true, but only one encourages restraint. The forest outside Schmidt offers no monument to guide interpretation. That absence is instructive. It refuses to tell us what to feel. It leaves the work of meaning to those who listen. In that silence, the most honest response may be neither celebration nor condemnation, but vigilance. Vigilance against narratives that simplify. Vigilance against systems that rely on heroism as a safety valve. Vigilance against forgetting that every extraordinary act of courage points back to an ordinary failure that came before it. These stories endure. Let them endure as boundaries, not banners. Let them mark the edge of what should be asked of a person, not the standard by which people are judged. Let them remind us that progress purchased at the cost of one person's future carries a debt that cannot be repaid with memory alone. Men who moved through that forest did what they had to do. One of them did more than anyone should have had to. The ground remembers nothing of it. The responsibility to remember and to learn belongs to us. Responsibility is not passive, and it is not comfortable. It demands more than retelling events or repeating names. It requires a willingness to sit with the implications of what those events reveal about power, decision-making, and the human cost embedded in systems that claim necessity as justification. The most difficult implications is this. Situations like Schmidt are not accidents. They are outcomes. They arise from accumulated choices, strategic hesitations, operational shortcuts, assumptions about terrain and enemy behavior that eventually compress risk downward until it rests on the shoulders of individuals who have no margin left. By the time someone like Kowalski acts, the decision space has already collapsed. His choice is not the beginning of the story. It is the end of a long chain. Perspective does not diminish his action. It sharpens it. It places it exactly where it belongs, at the point where abstraction fails and reality asserts itself. War is full of abstractions, objectives, sectors, timetables, but the moment those abstractions break, someone bleeds. Remembering that connection is essential if history is to be more than repetition. The temptation, especially in cultures that value resolve and decisiveness, to interpret stories like this as validation. Proof that the system works because someone always rises to the occasion. But that interpretation mistakes resilience for sustainability. A system that survives only because individuals are willing to destroy themselves to keep it moving is not strong. It is brittle, held together by the very people it consumes. Kowalski's action worked because it was exceptional. If it had been ordinary, it would not have worked at all. The machine gun reacted because it did not expect what it encountered. The platoon moved because they had not seen the ground broken that way before. Exceptionality was the mechanism. That is why repetition would hollow it out. What saves once cannot be relied upon twice. That's why militaries study these moments carefully and speak about them cautiously. They understand that valor cannot be institutionalized without losing its meaning. They understand that courage is not a resource to be expended at will. It is a human response to collapse, not a substitute for sound planning. Outside the profession of arms, the lesson is equally relevant. Any system, political, economic, social, that relies on extraordinary personal sacrifice to function has already crossed into dangerous territory. It may appear to operate, it may even succeed for a time, but it does so by drawing down something irreplaceable. Who witnessed Kowalski's choice did not come away with a desire to emulate it. They came away with a heightened sensitivity to early warning signs, to moments when pressure begins to pool in one place, to situations where silence becomes oppressive rather than calm. They learned to ask different questions sooner, not because they wanted to be heroes, but because they wanted to avoid needing one. That is perhaps the most transferable lesson of all. Prevention is quieter than rescue. It rarely produces stories worth telling, but it spares people from being forced into choices that cannot be undone. The highest respect for acts like Kowalski's is not imitation, but foresight. Time passes, the details of the forest will blur, names will be forgotten. Even the war itself will recede into abstraction. What must not be lost is the understanding that behind every story of extraordinary courage lies an ordinary failure that preceded it. Remembering only the courage without examining the failure risks honoring the symptom while ignoring the disease. The forest outside Schmidt has long since returned to itself. Trees grew, snow melted. Nothing remains to indicate that a man once stood there and chose to become the focus of destruction so others could move. That absence is honest. Nature does not commemorate, it erases. Memory is the only place where such moments persist. What we choose to do with that memory determines whether it becomes a justification or a warning. The difference is subtle, but the consequences are not. The story is carried forward. Let it be carried as a reminder of limits. Limits of systems, limits of doctrine, limits of what should ever be asked of an individual. Let it stand not as a call to valor, but as an argument for responsibility at every level above the person who finally steps forward. When someone has to do what Kowalski did, the question is not whether he was brave enough. The question is why the world around him. It indicates that redundancy is gone, margins are gone, and the system is running on borrowed time. At Henderson Field, Basilone stepped up because machine gun crews were dead, ammunition was running out, and doctrine no longer applied. On the forest road, the driver stepped up because the tank's engine failed and no recovery was possible. In both cases, the individual became a temporary patch for systemic breakdown. This is the point where popular narratives diverge sharply from reality. Stories emphasize willpower, grit, and determination. Reality emphasizes constraint, The people who endure these moments do not choose heroism. They choose between two forms of loss and take the one that preserves the system, even if it destroys them later. Later destruction is harder to see, which makes it easier to ignore. When wars end, societies rush to closure. They want demobilization, reintegration, and normalcy. They want to believe that the extraordinary behaviors demanded by war can be neatly folded back into ordinary life. This belief is not supported by evidence. People optimize for survival under extreme pressure, often struggle in environments where pressure is diffuse, ambiguous, and slow. The clarity of crisis disappears. The feedback loop breaks. Actions no longer produce immediate, tangible results. The skills that once mattered most, endurance, suppression of pain, relentless focus, lose their usefulness. Remains is a nervous system calibrated for emergencies that no longer arrive. This is why many veterans describe peace as strangely empty or overwhelming. Not because they miss violence, but because they miss coherence, War reduces the world to solvable problems with direct consequences. Peace expands it into uncertainties with delayed outcomes. The transition is not relief, it is destabilization. The German driver returned to a world where engines could be turned off without consequence, where machines could be left broken overnight, where failure did not mean immediate death, These conditions are healthier, but they are alien to someone whose survival depended on ignoring every instinct to stop. The difficulty is that societies benefit from this kind of adaptation while pretending it leaves no residue. They build myths of resilience that celebrate endurance but avoid discussing recovery. They honor the act without acknowledging the aftermath. This creates a cycle. Each war produces a generation of people who learned how to hold collapsing systems together with themselves. Each piece struggles to absorb them. The lesson learned by institutions is not restraint, but reliance. If necessary, someone will step up again. Reliance is dangerous. Plans that assume